Grace by James Joyce. Two gentlemen who were in the lavatory at the time tried to lift him up, but he was quite helpless. He lay curled up at the foot of the stairs, down which he had fallen. They succeeded in turning him over. He had rolled a few yards away, and his clothes were smeared in the filth and ooze on the floor which he had lain. Face downwards, his eyes were closed, and he breathed with a grunting noise. A thin stream of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. These two gentlemen and one of the curates carried him up the stairs and laid him down on the floor of the bar. In 2 minutes he was surrounded by a ring of men. The manager of the bar asked everyone who he was and who was with him. No one knew who he was, but one of the curates said he had served the gentleman with a small rum. Was he by himself? Asked the manager. No, sir, there was 2 gentlemen with him. And where are they? No one knew, a voice said. Give him air, he's fainted. The ring of onlookers distended and closed again elastically. A dark medal of blood had formed itself near the man's head on the tessellated floor. The manager, alarmed by the grey pallor of the man's face, sent for a policeman. His collar was unfastened, and his necklace undone. He opened his eyes for an instant, sighed, and closed them again. One of the gentlemen who had carried him upstairs held a ding silk hat in his hand. The manager asked him repeatedly, did no one know who the injured man was, or where had his friends gone? The doors of the bar opened, and an immense constable entered. A crowd which had followed him down the laneway collected outside the door, struggling to look through the glass panels. The manager at once began to narrate what he knew. The constable, a young man, with thick immobile features, listened. He moved his head slowly to the right and left, and the manager to the person on the floor, as if he feared to be the victim of some delusion. Then he drew off his glove, produced a small book from his waist, licked the lead of his pencil, and made ready to indite. He asked in a suspicious provincial accent, "Who is the man? What's his name and address?" A young man in a cycling suit cleared his way through the ring of bystanders. He knelt down promptly beside the injured man and called for water. The constable knelt down also to help. The young man washed the blood from the injured man's mouth, and then called for some brandy. The constable repeated the order in an authoritative voice until a curate came running with the glass. The brandy was forced down the man's throat. In a few seconds he opened his eyes and looked about him. He looked at the circle of faces, and then, understanding, strove to rise to his feet. "You're all right now?" asked the young man in the cycling suit. "Shaz, nothing," said the injured man, trying to stand up. He was helped to his feet. The manager said something about a hospital, and some of the bystanders gave advice. The battered silk hat was placed on the man's head. The constable asked, "Where do you live?" The man, without answering, began to twirl the ends of his mustache. He made light of his accent. "It was nothing," he said. "Only a little accident." He spoke very thickly. "Where do you live?" repeated the constable. The man said they were to get a cab for him. While the point was being debated, a tall, agile gentleman of fair complexion, wearing a long yellow ulster, came from the far end of the bar. Seeing the spectacle, he called out, "Hello, Tom, old man. What's the trouble?" "She has nothing," said the man. The newcomer surveyed the deplorable figure before him and then turned to the constable, saying, "It's all right, constable. I'll see him home." The constable touched his helmet and answered, "All right, Mr. Power." "Come on now, Tom," said Mr. Power, taking his friend by the arm. "No bones broken. What, can you walk?" The young man in the cycling suit took the man by the other arm, and the crowd divided. "How did you get yourself into this mess?" asked Mr. Power. "The gentleman fell down the stairs," said the young man. "I ought to lie to, sir," said the injured man. "Not at all. and we have little... Not now, not now. The three men left the bar, and the crowd sifted through the doors in the laneway. The manager brought the constable to the stairs to inspect the scene of the accident. They agreed that the gentleman must have missed his footing. The customers returned to the counter, and a curate set about removing the traces of blood from the floor. When they came out into Grafton Street, Mr. Power whistled for an outsider. The injured man again said as well as he could, "I really shall oblige you, sir. I hope we'll meet again. Your name is Kernan." The shock of the incipient pain had partly sobered him. "Don't mention it," said the young man. They shook hands. Mr. Kernan was hoisted onto the car, and when Mr. Power said, giving directions to the carman, he expressed his gratitude to the young man and regretted they could not have a little drink together. "Another time," said the young man. The car drove off towards Westmoreland Street. As it passed Ballast Office, the clock showed 9:30. A keen east wind hit them, blowing from the mouth of the river. Mr. Kernan was huddled together with cold. His friend asked him to yell how the accident had happened. "I ain't he answered. "Young is hurt." "Sho?" The other leaned over the well of the car and peered into Mr. Kernan's mouth, but he could not see. He struck a match and sheltered it with the shell of his hands. Peered again into the window, which Mr. Kernan opened obediently. The swaying movement of the car brought the match to and from the open mouth. The lower teeth and gums were covered and clotted with blood. In a minute piece of the tongue seemed to have been bitten off. The match was blown out. "That's ugly," said Mr. Power. "Shows nothing," said Mr. Kernan, closing his mouth and pulling the collar of his filthy coat across his neck. Mr. Kernan was a commercial traveler of the old school, which believed in the dignity of its calling. He had never been seen in the city without a silk hat of some decency and a pair of gaiters. By grace of these two articles of clothing, he said, a man could always pass muster. He carried on the tradition of his Napoleon, the great black-white, whose memory he evoked at times by legend and mimicry. Modern business methods had spared him only so far to allow him a little office in Crow Street, on the window blind of which was written the name of the firm with the address, London, E.C., on the mantelpiece of this little office, and a little leaden battalion of canisters was drawn up, and the table before the window stood 4 or 5 china bowls, which were usually half full of black liquid. From these bowls Mr. Kernan tasted tea. He took a mouthful, drew up, saturated his palate with it, and spat it forth into the grate. Then he paused to judge. Mr. Power, a much younger man, was employed by the Royal Irish Constabulary Office in Dublin Castle. The arc of his social rise intersected the arc of his friend's decline, but Mr. Kernan's decline was mitigated by the fact that certain of those friends who had known him at the highest point of success still esteemed him as a character. Mr. Power was one of these friends. His inexplicable depths were a byword in his circle. He was a debonair young man. The car halted before a small house on the Glasfin road, and Mr. Kernan was helped into the house. His wife put him to bed, while Mr. Power sat downstairs in the kitchen, asking the children where they went to school and what book they were in. The children, 2 girls and a boy, conscious of their father's helplessness and of their mother's absence, began some horseplay with him. He was surprised at their manners and at their accents, and his brow grew thoughtful. After a while Mrs. Kernan entered the kitchen, exclaiming, "Such a sight! Oh, he'll do for himself one day. And that's the holy alls of it. He's been drinking since Friday." Mr. Power was careful to explain to her that he was not responsible. He had come on the scene by the merest accident. Mrs. Kernan, remembering Mr. Power's good offices during domestic quarrels, as well as many small but opportune loans, said, Oh, you needn't tell me that, Mr. Power. I know you're a friend of his, not like some of the others he's done with. They're all right as long as he has money in his pocket to keep him out from his wife and family. Nice friends. Who was he with tonight, I'd like to know? Mr. Power shook his head and said nothing. I'm so sorry, she continued, that I've nothing in the house to offer you, but if you wait a minute, I'll send around to Fogarty's at the corner. Mr. Power stood up. We were waiting for him to come home with the money. He never seems to think he has a home anymore. Oh, now, Mrs. Kernan, said Mrs. Power, we'll make him turn over a new leaf. I'll talk to Martin. He's the man. We'll come here one of these nights and talk it over. She saw him to the door. The carman was stamping up and down the footpath and swinging his arms to warm himself. It's very kind of you to bring him home, she said. Not at all, said Mr. Power. He got up on the car as it drove off. He raised his hat to her galley. We'll make a new man of him, he said. Good night, Miss Kernan. Mrs. Kernan's puzzled eyes watched the car till it was out of sight, and she withdrew them, went into the house and emptied her husband's pockets. She was an active, practical woman of middle age. Not long before, she had celebrated her silver wedding and renewed her intimacy with her husband by waltzing with him to Mr. Power's accompaniment. In her days of courtship, Mr. Kernan had seemed to her a ungallant figure, and she still hurried to the chapel door whenever a wedding was reported. And seeing the bridal pair recalled a vivid pleasure now. She had passed out on the star of the sea church in Sandy Mount, leaning on the arm of the jovial, well-fed man. She was dressed smartly in a frock coat and lavender trousers, and carried a silk hat gracefully, balanced upon his other arm. After 3 weeks, he had found a wife's life irksome, and later on, when she was beginning to find it unbearable, she had become a mother. The part of a mother presented to her no insuperable difficulties. In 25 years, she had kept house shrewdly for her husband. Her 2 eldest sons were launched. One was in draper's shop in Glasgow. The other was a clerk to a tea merchant in Belfast. They were good sons, wrote regularly, and sometimes sent home money. The other children were still in school. Mr. Kernan sent a letter to his office next day and remained in bed. She made beef tea for him and scolded him roundly. She accepted his frequent intemperance as part of the climate, healed him dutifully whenever he was sick, and always tried to make him eat breakfast. There were worse husbands. He had never been a violent since the boys had grown up, and she knew that he would walk to the end of Thomas Street and back to the book even a small order. Back again to book even a small order. The 2 nights after, his friends came to see him. She brought them to his bedroom, the air of which was impregnated with a personal odor, and gave them chairs at the fire. Mr. Kernan's tongue, the occasional stinging pain of which had made him somewhat irritable during the day, became more polite. He sat propped up in the bed by pillows, and the little color of his puffy cheeks made them resemble warm cinders. He apologized to his guests for the disorder of the room, but at the same time looked at them a little proudly, with veteran's pride. He was quite unconscious that he was the victim of a plot which his friends, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. McCoy, and Mr. Power, had disclosed to Mrs. Kernan in the parlor. The idea being Mr. Power's, but its development was entrusted to Mr. Cunningham. Mr. Kernan came of Protestant stock, and though he had been converted to the Catholic faith at the time of his marriage, he had not been in the pale of the church for 20 years. He was fond, moreover, of giving a side thrust at Catholicism. Mr. Cunningham was the very man for such a case. He was the elder colleague of Mr. Power. His own domestic life was very happy. People had great sympathy with him, for it was known that he had married an unpresentable woman who was an incurable drunkard. He set up house for her 6 times, and each time she had pawned furniture on him. Everyone had respect for poor Martin Cunningham. He was a thoroughly sensible man, influential and intelligent. He made his blade of human knowledge, natural astuteness, particularized by long association with cases in the police courts, had been tempered by brief immersions in the waters of general philosophy. He was well informed. His friends bowed to his opinions and considered that his face was like Shakespeare's. When the plot had been disclosed to her, Mrs. Kernan had said, "I leave it all in your hands, Mr. Cunningham." After a quarter of a century of married life, she had very few illusions left. Religion for her was habit. She suspected that a man of her husband's age would not change greatly before death. He was tempted to see a curious appropriateness in his accident, but that she did not wish to seem bloody-minded, would have told the gentleman that Mr. Kernan's tongue would not suffer being shortened. However, Mr. Cunningham was a capable man, and religion was religion. The scheme might do good, and at least it could do no harm. Her beliefs were not extravagant. She believed steadily in the Sacred Heart as the most generally useful of all Catholic devotions, and approved of the sacraments. Her faith was bounded by her kitchens, but if she was put to it, she could believe also in the Banshee and in the Holy Ghost. The gentleman began to talk of the accident. Mr. Cunningham said that he had once known a similar case. A man of 70 had bitten off a piece of his tongue during an epileptic fit, and the tongue had filled in again, so no one could see a trace of the bite. "Well, I'm not 70, said the invalid. "God forbid," said Mr. Cunningham. "It doesn't pain you now?" asked Mr. McCoy. Mr. McCoy had been, at the time, a tenor of some reputation. His wife, who had been a soprano, still taught young children to play the piano at low terms. His line of life had been the shortest distance between 2 points, and for short periods he had been driven to live by his wits. He had been a clerk in the Midland Railway, a canvasser for advertisements for the Irish Times and for the Freeman's Journal, a town traveller for a coal firm on commission, a private inquiry agent, a clerk in the office of sub-sheriff, and he had recently become secretary to the city coroner. His new office made him professionally interested in Mr. Kernan's case. "Pain? Not so much," answered Mr. McKernan. "But it's so sickening. I feel as if I wanted to retch off." "That's the booze," said Mr. Cunningham firmly. "No," said Mr. Kernan. "I think I caught cold of the car. There's something keeps coming into my throat. Phlegm or mucus," said Mr. McCoy. "It keeps coming like from down in my throat. Sickening." Yes, said Mr. McCoy. "That's the thorax." He looked at Mr. Cunningham and Mr. Power at the same time with an air of challenge. Mr. Cunningham nodded his head rapidly, and Mr. Power said, "Ah, well. All's well that ends well." "I'm very much obliged to you, old man," said the invalid. Mr. Power waved his hand. "Those other 2 fellows I was with." Who were you with?" asked Mr. Cunningham. "A chap, I don't know his name. Damn it now, what's his name? Little chap with sandy hair." "And who else?" "Harford." Said Mr. Cunningham. When Mr. Cunningham made that remark, people were silent. It was known that the speaker had secret sources of information. In this case, the monosyllable had a moral intention. Mr. Harford sometimes formed one of a little detachment which left the city shortly after noon on Sunday, with the purpose of arriving as soon as possible at some public house on the outskirts of the city, where its members duly qualified themselves as bona fide travelers, but his fellow travelers had never consented to overlook his origin. He had begun his life as an obscure financier by lending small sums of money to workmen as usurious interest. Later on he had become the partner of a very fat, short gentleman, Mr. Goldberg, in the Liffey Loan Bank. Though he had never embraced more than the Jewish ethical code, his fellow Catholics, whenever they had smarted him in person or by proxy under his exactions, spoke of him bitterly as an Irish Jew and an illiterate, and saw divine disapproval of usury made manifest through the person of his idiot son. At other times they remembered his good points. "I wonder where did he go to?" said Mr. Kernan. He wished the details of the incident to remain vague. He wished his friends to think there had been some mistake, that Mr. Harford and he had missed each other. His friends, who knew quite well Mr. Harford's manners in drinking, were silent. Mr. Power said again, "All's well that ends well." Mr. Kernan changed the subject at once. "That was a decent young chap, that medical fellow," he said. "Only for him." "Oh, only for him," said Mr. Power. "It might have been a case of 7 days without an option of fine." Yes, said Mr. Kernan, trying to remember. "I remember how there was a policeman, decent young fellow he seemed. How did it happen at all?" "It happened that you were pilloried, Tom," said Mr. Cunningham gravely. "True, Bill," said Mr. Kernan, equally gravely. "I suppose you squared the constable, Jack," said Mr. McCoy. Mr. Power did not relish the use of his Christian name. He was not straight-laced, but he could not forget that Mr. McCoy recently made a crusade in search of valises and portmanteaus to enable Mrs. McCoy to fulfill imaginary engagements in the country. More than he resembled the fact that he had been victimized, and he resented such low playing of the game. He answered the question, therefore, as if Mr. Kernan had asked it. The narrative made Mr. Kernan indignant. He was keenly conscious of his citizenship, wished to live in his city on terms mutually honorable, and resented any affront put upon him by those whom he called country bumpkins. "Is this what we pay for?" he asked. "To feed and clothe these ignorant basthoons? And they're nothing else." Mr. Cunningham laughed. He was a castle official only during office hours. "How could they be anything else, Tom?" he said. He assumed a thick provincial accent, and said in tone of command, 65, catch your cabbage." Everyone laughed. Mr. McCoy, who wanted to enter the conversation by any door, pretended that he had never heard the story. Mr. Cunningham said, "It's supposed, they say, to take place in the depot where they get these thundering big country fellows, hounds, to drill. The sergeant made them stand in a row against the wall, hold up their plates." He illustrated the story by grotesque gestures. "At dinner, then he had a bloody big bowl of cabbage before him on the table, and the bloody big spoon like a shovel. He takes up a wad of cabbage on the spoon and pegs it across the room, and the poor devils have to try and catch it on their plates. 65, catch your cabbage." Everyone laughed again, but Mr. Kernan was somewhat indignant still. He talked of writing a letter to the papers. "These yahoos coming up here," he said, "think they can boss the people. I needn't tell you, Martin, what kind of men they are." Mr. Cunningham gave a qualified assent. "It's like everything else in this world," he said. "You get some bad ones and you get some good ones." "Oh, yes, you get some good ones, I admit," said Mr. Kernan, satisfied. "It's better to have nothing to say to them," said Mr. McCoy. "That's my opinion." Mrs. Kernan entered the room, and placing the tray on the table, said, "Help yourselves, gentlemen." Mr. Power stood up to officiate, offering her his chair. She declined it, saying she was ironing downstairs, and after having exchanged a nod with Mr. Cunningham behind Mr. Power's back, prepared to leave the room. Her husband called out to her, "Have you nothing for me, Ducky?" "Oh, you. The back of my hand to you," said Mrs. Kernan tartly. Her husband called after her, "Nothing for poor little hubby?" He assumed such a comical face and voice that the distribution of the bottles of stout took place amid general merriment. The gentlemen drank from their glasses, set the glasses again on the table, and paused. Then Mr. Cunningham turned towards Mr. Power and said casually, On Thursday night, you said, Jack. Thursday, yes, said Mr. Power. Righto, said Mr. Cunningham promptly. We can meet in McAlley's, said Mr. McCoy. That'll be the most convenient place. But we mustn't be late, said Mr. Power earnestly, because it is sure to be crammed to the doors. We can meet at 7:30, said Mr. McCoy. Righto, said Mr. Cunningham. 7:30 at McAuley's, be it. There was a short silence. Mr. Kernan waited to see whether he would be taken into his friend's confidence. Then he asked, What's in the wind? Oh, it's nothing, said Mr. Cunningham. It's only a little matter that we're arranging about for Thursday. The opera, is it? Said Mr. Kernan. No, said Mr. Cunningham, in an invasive tone. It's just a little spiritual matter. Oh, said Mr. Kernan. There was silence again. Then Mr. Power said, point blank, To tell you the truth, Tom, we're going to make a retreat. Yes, that's it, said Mr. Cunningham. Jack and I and McCoy here, we're all going to wash the pot. He uttered the metaphor with a certain homely energy. Encouraged by his own voice, proceeded, You see, we may as well admit we're a nice collection of scoundrels, one and all. And I say one and all, he added with a gruff charity and turning to Mr. Power. Own up now. I own up, said Mr. Power. And I own up, said Mr. McCoy. So we're going to wash the pot together, said Mr. Cunningham. A thought seemed to strike him. He turned suddenly to the invalid and said, Do you know what, Tom, has just occurred to me? You might join in, and we have 4 ranked reel. Good idea, said Mr. Power, the 4 of us together. Mr. Kernan was silent. The proposal conveyed very little meaning to his mind, understanding that some spiritual agencies about to concern themselves to his behalf. He thought he owed to his dignity a show of stiff neck. He took no part in the conversation for a long while, but listened with an air of calm enmity while his friends discussed the Jesuits. I haven't such a bad opinion of the Jesuits, he said, intervening at length. They're an educated order. I believe they mean well, too. They're the grandest order of the church, Tom, said Mr. Cunningham, with enthusiasm. The general of the Jesuits stands next to the Pope. There's no mistake about it, said Mr. McCoy. If you want a thing well done, and no flies about it, you go to a Jesuit. They're the boys, have influence. I'll tell you in point. The Jesuits are a fine body of men, said Mr. Power. It's a curious thing, said Mr. Cunningham, about the Jesuit order. Every other order in the church had to be reformed at some time or other, but the Jesuit order had never once reformed. It never fell away. Is that so? Asked Mr. McCoy. That's a fact, said Mr. Cunningham. That's history. Look at the church, too, said Mr. Power. Look at the congregation they have. The Jesuits cater for the upper classes, said Mr. McCoy. Of course, said Mr. Power. Yes, said Mr. Kernan. That's why I have a feeling for them. It's some of those secular priests, ignorant, bumptious. They're all good men, said Mr. Cunningham. Each in his own way, the Irish priesthood is honored all over the world. Oh yes, said Mr. Power. Not like some of the other priesthoods on the continent, said Mr. McCoy, unworthy of the name. Perhaps you're right, said Mr. Kernan, relenting. Of course I'm right, said Mr. Cunningham. I haven't been in the world all this time and seen most sides of it without being a judge of character. The gentlemen drank again, one following another's example. Mr. Kernan seemed to be weighing something in his mind. He was impressed. He had a high opinion of Mr. Cunningham as a judge of character. As a reader of faces, he asked for particulars. Oh, it's just a retreat, said Mr. Cunningham. Father Purdon is giving it. It's for businessmen, He won't be too hard on us, Tom, said Mr. Power persuasively. Father Purdon? Father Purdon? Said the invalid. Oh, you must know him, Tom, said Mr. Cunningham stoutly. Fine, jolly fellow. He's a man of the world like ourselves. Ah, yes, I think I know him. Rather red-faced, tall. That's the man. And tell me, Martin, is he a good preacher? No. It's not exactly a sermon, It's just kind of friendly talk, in a common sense way. Mr. Kernan deliberated. Mr. McCoy said, Father Tom Burke that was the boy. Oh, Father Tom Burke, said Mr. Cunningham. He was a born orator. Did you ever hear him, Tom? Did I ever hear him? Said the invalid, nettled. Rather, I heard him. And yet they say he wasn't much of a theologian, said Mr. Cunningham. Is that so? Said Mr. McCoy. Of course, nothing wrong, only sometimes they say he didn't preach that was quite orthodox. Ah, he was a splendid man, said Mr. McCoy. I heard him once, Mr. Kernan continued. I forget the subject of his discourse now. Crofton and I were in the back of the pit, the body, said Mr. Cunningham. Yes, in the back, near the door. I forget now that. Oh yes, it was on the Pope. The late Pope. I remember it well. Upon my word, it was magnificent. The style of the oratory, and his voice. God, hadn't he a voice? The prisoner of the Vatican, he called him. I remember Crofton saying to me when he came out, But he's an orange man, Crofton, isn't he? Said Mr. Power. Of course he is, said Mr. Kernan. And a damn decent orange man, too. He went into Butler's in Moore's Street. Faith was genuinely moved. Tell you God's truth, and I remember well his very words. Kernan, he said, we worship at different altars, he said, but our belief is the same. Struck me as a very well put. There's a good deal in that, said Mr. Power. There used to always be crowds of Protestants in the chapel where Father Tom was preaching. There's not much difference between us, said Mr. McCoy. We both believe in, he hesitated for a moment, in the Redeemer, only they don't believe in the Pope and in the Mother of God. But of course, said Mr. Cunningham quietly and effectively, our religion is the religion, the old, original faith. Not a doubt about it, said Mr. Kernan warmly. Mrs. Kernan came to the door of the bedroom and announced, Here's a visitor for you. Who is it? Mr. Fogarty. Oh, come in, come in. A pale, oval-faced man. Pale, oval face came towards into the light. The arc of its fair, trailing mustache was repeated in the fair eyebrows looped above pleasantly astonished eyes. Mr. Fogarty was a modest grocer. He had failed in business in a licensed house in the city because his financial condition had constrained him to tie himself to second-class distillers and brewers. He had opened a small shop on Glasnevin Road where he flattered himself his manners would ingratiate him with the housewives of the district. He bore himself with a certain grace, complimented little children, and spoke with neat enunciation. He was not without culture. Mr. Fogarty brought a gift with him, a half-pint of special whiskey. He inquired politely for Mr. Kernan, placed his gift on the table, and sat down with the company on equal terms. Mr. Kernan appreciated the gift, all the more he was aware that there was a small account for groceries unsettled between him and Fogarty, he said. I wouldn't doubt you, old man. Open that, Jack, will you? Mr. Power again officiated. Glasses were rinsed and 5 small measures of whiskey were poured out. This new influence enlivened the conversation. Mr. Fogarty, sitting on the small area of the chair, was especially interested. Pope Leo the 13th, said Mr. Cunningham, was one of the lights of the age. His great idea, was the union of the Latin and the Greek churches. That was the aim of his life. I often heard he was one of the most intellectual men in Europe, said Mr. Power. I mean, apart from him being Pope. So he was, said Mr. Cunningham, if not the most so. His motto, as Pope, was lux upon lux, light upon light. No, said Mr. Fogarty eagerly. I think you're wrong there. It was lux in tenebris, I think, light in darkness. Oh yes, said Mr. McCoy. Tenebrae. Allow me, said Mr. Cunningham positively. It was lux upon lux, and Pius IX, his predecessor's motto, was crux upon crux, that is, cross upon cross. to show the difference between their two pontificates. The inference was allowed, Mr. Cunningham continued. Pope Leo, you know, was a great scholar and a poet. He had a strong face, said Mr. Kernan. Yes, said Mr. Cunningham. He wrote Latin poetry. Is that so? Said Mr. Fogarty. Mr. McCoy tasted his whiskey contentedly and shook his head with a double intention, saying, That's no joke, I can tell you. We didn't learn that, Tom, said Mr. Power, following Mr. McCoy's example. We went to the penny-a-week school. There was many a good man went to the penny-a-week school, with sod of turf under his oxter, said Mr. Kernan sensuously. Old system was the best, plain honest education, none of your modern trumpetry. Quite right, said Mr. Power. No superfluities, said Mr. Fogarty. He enunciated the word and then drank gravely. I remember reading, said Mr. Cunningham, that one of Pope Leo's poems was the invention of the photograph, in Latin, of course. One of the Pope's poems was on the invention of the photograph, in Latin, of course. On the photograph, exclaimed Mr. Kernan. Yes, said Mr. Cunningham. He also drank from his glass. Well, you know, said Mr. McCoy, isn't the photograph wonderful when you come to think of it? Of course, said Mr. Power. Great minds can see things, as the poet says. Great minds are very near to sadness. As the poet says, great minds are very near to madness, said Mr. Fogarty. Mr. Kernan seemed to be troubled in mind. He made an effort to recall the Protestant theology on some thorny points, and in the end addressed Mr. Cunningham. Tell me, Martin, he said, weren't some of the popes, of course, not our present man, or his predecessor, but some of the old popes, not exactly, up to the knocker? There was a silence. Mr. Cunningham said, Of course, there were some bad lots, but the astonishing thing is, not one of them, not the biggest drunkard, not the most out-and-out ruffian, not one of them ever preached ex cathedra, a word of false doctrine. Now isn't that an astonishing thing? That is, said Mr. Kernan. Yes, because when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, Mr. Fogarty explained, he is infallible. Yes, said Mr. Cunningham. Oh, I know about the infallibility of the Pope. I remember I was younger then. Or was it that? Mr. Fogarty interrupted. He took up the bottle and helped the others to a little more. Mr. McCoy, seeing that there was not enough to go round, pleaded that he had not finished with his measure. The others accepted under protest. The light music of whiskey falling into glasses made an agreeable interlude. What's that you were saying, Tom? Asked Mr. McCoy. Papal infallibility, said Mr. Cunningham. That was the greatest scene in the whole history of the church. How was that, Martin? Asked Mr. Power. Mr. Cunningham held up two thick fingers. In the sacred college, of cardinals and archbishops and bishops, there were two men who held out against it, while the others were all for it. The whole conclave, except those two, were unanimous. No, they wouldn't have it. Ha, said Mr. McCoy. And they were a German cardinal by the name of Dowling. Dowling was no German. But that's a sure five, said Mr. Power, laughing. Well, this great German cardinal, whether his name was one or the other was John McHale. What? Cried Mr. Kernan. Is it John of Tom? Are you sure of that now? Asked Mr. Fogarty dubiously. I thought it was some Italian or American. John of Tom, repeated Mr. Cunningham, was the man. He drank, and the other gentlemen followed his lead. Then he resumed. There they were at it, all the cardinals and bishops and archbishops from all the ends of the earth, and these two fighting dog and devil, until at last the Pope himself stood up and declared infallibility a dogma of the Church ex cathedra. On the very moment, John McHale, who had been arguing and arguing against it, stood up and shouted out, with the voice of a lion, Credo. I believe, said Mr. Fogarty. Credo, said Mr. Cunningham. That showed that the faith he had. He submitted the moment The Pope spoke. "And what about Dowling?" asked Mr. McCoy. The German cardinal wouldn't submit. He left the church. Mr. Cunningham's words had built up the vast image of the church in the minds of the hearers. His deep, raucous voice had thrilled them, and as he uttered the word of belief and submission. When Mrs. Kernan came into the room, drying her hands, she came into a solemn company. She did not disturb the silence, but leaned over the rail at the foot of the bed. "I once saw Joel McHale," said Mr. Kernan. "I'll never forget it as long as I live." He turned towards his wife to be confirmed. "I often told you that." Mrs. Kernan nodded. "I was at the unveiling of Sir John Gray's statue." Edmund Dwyer's Grays was speaking, blathering away. And here was this old fellow, crabbed-looking old chap, looking at him from under his bushy eyebrows. Mr. Kernan knitted his brows and, lowering his head, like an angry bull, glared at his wife. "God," he exclaimed, resuming his natural face, "I never saw such an eye in a man's head." It was as much to say, "I have you properly taped, my lad." He had an eye like a hawk. "None of the Greys was any good," said Mr. Power. There was a pause again. Mr. Power turned to Mrs. Kernan and said, with an abrupt joviality, "Well, Mrs. Kernan, you're going to make your man here a good, holy, pious, and God-fearing Roman Catholic." He swept his arm around company inclusively. "We're all going to make a retreat together and confess our sins, and God knows we want it badly." "I don't mind," said Mr. Kernan, smiling a little nervously. Mrs. Kernan thought it would be wiser to conceal her satisfaction, so she said, "I pity the poor priest that has to listen to your tale." Mr. Kernan's expression changed. "If he doesn't like it," he said bluntly, "he can do the other thing. I'll just tell him my little tale of woe." "I'm not such a bad fellow," Mr. Cunningham intervened promptly. "We'll all renounce the devil," he said, together, not forgetting his works and pomps. "Get behind me, Satan," said Mr. Fogarty, laughing and looking at the others. Mr. Power said nothing. He felt completely out-generaled, but a pleased expression flickered across his face. "All we have to do," said Mr. Cunningham, "is to stand up with lighted candles on our hands and renew our baptismal vows." "Oh, don't forget the candle, Tom," said Mr. McCoy, "whatever you do." "What?" said Mr. Kernan. "Must I have a candle?" "Oh, yes," said Mr. Cunningham. "Now, damn it all," said Mr. Kernan sensibly, "I draw the line there. I'll do the job right enough. I'll do the retreat business and confession, and all that business, but no candles. No, damn it all, I bar the candles." He shook his head with farcical gravity. "Listen to that," said his wife. "I bar the candles," said Mr. Kernan, conscious of having created an effect on his audience and continuing to shake his head to and fro. "Bar the magic lantern business." Everyone laughed heartily. "There's a nice Catholic for you," said his wife. "No candles," repeated Mr. Kernan, obdurately. "That's off." The transept of the Jesuit church in Gardner Street was almost full, and still at every moment gentlemen entered from the side door and directed the lay brother walked on tiptoe along the aisles until they found seating accommodation. The gentlemen were all dressed and orderly. The light of the lamps on the church fell upon an assembly of black clothes and white collars, relieved here and there by tweeds, on dark model pillars, on green marble, and on lugubrious canvases. The gentlemen sat in the benches, having hitched their trousers slightly above their knees and laid their hats in security. They sat well back and gazed formally at the distant speck of red light which was suspended before the high altar. On one of the benches near the pulpit sat Mr. Cunningham and Mr. Kernan. In the bench behind sat Mr. McCoy alone, and in the bench behind him sat Mr. Power and Mr. Fogarty. Mr. McCoy had tried unsuccessfully to find a place in the bench with the others, and then the party had settled down in the form of a quincunx. He had tried unsuccessfully to make comic remarks. As these had not been well received, he had desisted. Even he was sensible of the decorous atmosphere, and he began to respond to the religious stimulus in a whisper. Mr. Cunningham drew Mr. Kernan's attention to Mr. Harford's, the moneylender, who sat some distance off, and to Mr. Fanning, the registration agent and mayor-maker of the city, who was sitting immediately under the pulpit, besides one of the newly elected councillors of the ward. To the right sat old Michael Grimes, the owner of 3 pawnbrokers' shops, and Dan Hogan's nephew, who was up for the job in the town's clerk office. Farther in front sat Mr. Hendrick, the chief reporter of the Freeman's Journal, and poor O'Carroll's, an old friend of Mr. Kernan's, who had been at one time a considerable commercial figure. Gradually, as he recognized familiar faces, Mr. Kernan began to feel more at home. His hat, which had been rehabilitated by his wife, rested upon his knees. Once or twice he pulled down his cuffs, and with one hand, while he held the brim of his hat lightly but firmly with the other hand. A powerful-looking figure, the upper part of which was draped with a white surplice, was observed to be struggling into the pulpit. Simultaneously the congregation, unsettled, produced handkerchiefs and knelt upon them with care. Mr. Kernan followed the general example. The priest's figure now stood upright in the pulpit. 2/3 of its bulk, crowned by a massive red face, appeared above the balustrade. Father Purdon knelt down, turned towards the red speck of light, and covering his face with his hands, prayed. After an interval he uncovered his face and rose. The congregation rose also and settled again on its benches. Mr. Kernan restored his hat to its original position on his knee and presented an attentive face to the preacher. The preacher turned back each wide sleeve of his surplice with an elaborate large gesture, and slowly surveyed the array of faces. Then he said, "For the children of this world are wiser in their generation, than the children of light. Wherefore make unto yourselves friends out of the mammon of iniquity, so that when you die, they may receive you into everlasting dwellings." Father Purdon developed the text with resonant assurance. It was one of the most difficult texts in all the scriptures. He said to interpret it properly, it was a text which might seem to the casual observer at variance with the lofty morality elsewhere preached by Jesus Christ. But he told his hearers the text had seemed to him specifically adapted for the guidance of those whose lot it was to lead the life of the world, and who yet wished to lead that life not in the manner of worldlings. It was a text for businessmen and professional men. Jesus Christ, with his divine understanding of even cranny of human nature, understood that all men were not called to the religious life, that by far the vast majority were forced to live in the world, and to a certain extent for the world. And in this sentence, he designed to give them a word of counsel, settling before them as exemplars to the religious life, whose very worshippers of mammon, who were all men, the least solicitous in manners religious. He told his hearers that he was there that evening for no terrifying, no extravagant purpose. As a man of the world speaking to his fellow man, he came to speak to businessmen, and he would speak to them in a business-like way. If he might use the metaphor, he said, he was their spiritual accountant. He wished each and every one of their hearers to open those books of his spiritual life, and see if they tallied accurately with conscience. Jesus Christ was not a hard taskmaster. He understood our little failings, understood the weakness of poor fallen nature, understood the temptations of his life. We might have had, but we all had from time to time our temptations. We all had our failings, but one thing only, he said, we could ask of his hearers, and that was to be straight and manly with God. Their accounts were tallied in every point to say, Well, I have verified my accounts. I find all well. But if, as might happen, there were some discrepancies, to admit the truth, to be frank and say like a man. Well, I have looked into my accounts. I find this wrong, and this wrong. But with God's grace, I will rectify this, and this. I will set right my accounts. And that's the end of Grace by James Joyce. Yeah, I like that story. I was actually raised Catholic. I was raised Catholic, and I'm not Christian anymore. But uh, I I get sometimes I study the Bible or study the faith, or I like hearing people talk about priests and the popehood, and I like people talking about religion. I like studying religion. I don't believe it's real anymore. I don't believe the actual religion is real, but I do believe that it is. It's something to study. I believe religion is something to study and something to learn from. Especially early in the story when Mr. Kearney got drunk and he was really kind of injured himself. There's blood coming out of his body, and people like that need religion. People who are struggling need religion. And I don't mean believe it's literally true. Like, for example, I love Santa Claus, but I don't believe Santa Claus is real. But I still like thinking about Santa Claus. In the same way I still like thinking about Jesus. I like thinking about Jesus in the way I like thinking about Santa Claus. In the same way, it's like a magical fantasy. It's just magic. It's just another form of magic like Peter Pan or fairies or Cinderella or the Wicked Witch of the West or the devil, any of that stuff. Heaven, it's all magic. And I believe magic can be as real as you want it to be. That's my personal opinion. I don't defend anyone. I believe magic can be as real as you want it to be. I believe if you believe religion is real, then it is real to you. Whatever you believe is real to you. If you believe Harry Potter is real, then it is real to you. And whatever you believe in, you can make your reality. If you believe you can fly, then you can fly. Like R. Kelly says, I believe I can fly. I believe I can touch the sky. I think about it every night and day. I think about it all the time. I believe I can soar. You see me running through that open door. Oh, I believe I can fly. And just like R. Kelly says, it's just like when you study, magic is like studying the Bible. And studying the Bible is like studying magic. And there is worth in that. Even if you don't think it's real, even if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe there are parts of the Bible I don't like this is immoral, this is immoral, this is immoral. I do believe some things are immoral, but it's up for us to decide what's immoral. It's up for us to decide how we want to live. We can't let someone else tell us how to live, but we should listen to how the preachers or Protestant preachers or Catholic priests talk about this. It can be helpful to you in different ways to listen to how they talk about it. It's helpful, priests are a asexual bunch, and it's always been helpful that there has been asexuals at the head of the church, at least one church. It's beneficial that there are asexuals at the head of a church because it shows people that it is possible to be asexual, even though it might be difficult or you might live differently than everyone else does, but it's a way to live. Anyways, and sometimes drinking, people have problems drinking, and people don't, I don't even want to drink because I don't want to have health problems because I already have enough health problems. I don't want more health problems from drinking. That's just me. I know other people have to walk their own path and live however they want to live, but me, I don't want to drink because I don't want to have worse health problems than I already do. That's just me. Let me know in the comments below, what are your thoughts of Grace by James Joyce? Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps out the channel a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.